Hello, this is Mr. Smith, and this is the first lecture for Honors Government 2, Comparative Government, looking at Athenian democracy. Athenian democracy is one of the first well-known recordings of the use of the people's vote. Democracy comes from Greek demos and kratos, which means the people rule. Here you can see a picture of some of the ancient structures in Athens, where the people, of course, would converse civically in order to create laws. The most notable of all of the bodies that the Athenians used would be the assembly, where thousands of free, native-born men would come together in order to create laws. First of all, the Athenian system we take quite a few different aspects from, particularly democracy, as I just mentioned. Also the idea of aristocracy, or nobles, people born with a certain amount of wealth or property that is passed on from generation to generation. Oligarchy, which is a type of government where there is a small group of people that rules over it. Citizens, of course, the idea of individual participants civically in the system. Tyrant would be a body of people or an individual that controls with absolute power. It wasn't necessarily a bad thing at first. Tyrants were people put in charge during emergency situations, but of course today and for a number of centuries it's been equivalent with evil or harsh rule. And of course there's a number of figures that are influential from the Athenian period, including these philosophers Socrates and Plato, who would later on be a teacher to Aristotle, but also people like Pericles, who was the embodiment of pride in the democratic system that existed in Athens, perhaps a little bit too much to its detriment. But we'll start by looking at Athens' beginning. A monarchy is a form of government in which one person, such as king, queen, or emperor, rules and holds power. The power is usually, but not always, passed down through the family. Cecrops was the mythical first king of Athens, and Athens, like many city-states or other organizations throughout the world, started off as monarchies, where there was one powerful family with enough wealth or following that they were able to protect its citizens, while in many cases also this individual often took advantage of the work and resources of those around them. That wasn't always necessarily true. And this often developed through conquest, because this was a leading family militarily that helped a community gather large amounts of power and lands, or it's because of a rich family system that saw a patriarch, or in some rare cases a matriarch, as head, or it was simply divine right of kings, the fact that local religion basically saw a god or gods passing favoritism on to a particular family or individual in order to hold power. No matter what the case, though, whenever one holds on to power, others are inevitably going to become jealous, whether it's his own close family members or extended family or other nobles. They're simply not going to want to have that one person continue to hold power. And that's why we eventually come about with oligarchy. Oligarchy is a form of government in which a small group of people, usually wealthy aristocrats, rule and hold power together. Aristocrats were wealthy landowners in ancient Greece, and throughout civilizations they've often, like monarchs, passed along their power or land through relations, particularly to their children. And Greece did not just simply have oligarchy in Athens, also in other places like Sparta, for instance. Originally, the kings ruled these city-states, but in a number of them, it passed to the aristocracy, so it was ruled like an oligarchy, a small group of people. However, the aristocrats weren't necessarily much better than monarchs, as often they were too strict on the other citizens, hoping to squeeze as much power and resources and wealth out of others. And, of course, they expected a lot of privilege from their positions, so they often treated others unfairly, especially in eyes of punishment or crime. And so often oligarchy began to become tyrannical as well. particularly when some type of reform was introduced. Many figured that it would help regulate and organize society better to make it more just, but in fact it had a long-lasting negative impact. Draco was a noble who introduced a codified system of laws, which was a big deal back then because previous to this, a lot of rules, a lot of laws are passed along by word of mouth, by oral tradition, by culture and superstition. But it was considered monumental whenever laws were written down for the first time, like the Ten Commandments or Hammurabi's Code, for instance. And so Draco introduced codified laws, but the punishments for them were extremely harsh, especially for those that were not aristocrats. Such strict laws made the people extremely bitter and basically drew sympathy from some of the other aristocrats. And so Draco's codified laws, of course, eventually caused the word draconian, which comes from the name Draco, to mean something is harsh. So if you're a tough boss, for instance, and you have really high, ridiculous expectations, it's often said that the workplace or the boss is draconian in nature. So one of the aristocrats by the name of Solon, Solon, tried to fix this system by making all of the native-born Athenian citizens or someone who has the right to participate in government. The Athenians, of course, were eager for this because they wanted to abolish the oligarchical aristocracy. However, there would be a brief interlude before continued reform could take place. Pisistratus, which is spelled Peistratus, was an oligarch that came to power, and he held on to it through force, and so he became a new tyrant in ancient Athens. And after he died, another group of aristocrats took over. And so amongst these new aristocrats, there was one reform-minded person that wanted to reform the system permanently. So that way, another situation where one person took over or a small group of people became tyrannical would be virtually impossible. And so Clisthenes, which is spelled Cleisthenes, took power. He was a member of a rich and powerful family, but he had different plans for Athens instead of the status quo. He wanted direct democracy, a type of government in which the power is held by the people. Every citizen, in this case a freeborn man of Athens, can vote on every issue. Citizens would gather atop a flat-topped hill in Athens to debate and vote. Citizens participated in many ways. As many as 6,000 citizens were expected to participate in the assembly. Eventually, this became too chaotic, so the city of Athens was broken up into districts, and each of them got 50 representatives to sit on what was called the Council of 500. These 500 council members would develop an agenda for the assembly, because otherwise 6,000 people arguing and debating over law would be incredibly chaotic. All citizens then would have the right to vote and were urged to participate in the assembly in making laws. Citizens gave speeches, they debated, and after the speeches were over, voting took place. Voting was usually done by a show of hands, but not always. For major decisions, 6,000 citizens were needed in order for a vote to take place, and of course this would be predetermined by the Council of 500. It was difficult, of course, for this to happen, and this is why the council was needed. Of course, even 500 people is quite sizable, but it was meant to be inclusive. So that way, once again, it's not an incredibly small group of people creating this agenda and manipulating a larger assembly. This would be one of the first major instances of recorded direct democracy. The assembly itself was a group of citizens who gathered together to pass these laws. Ancient Athenian citizens were expected to participate. It was considered a proud sense of civic duty. In the 5th century BC, public sleighs were used to herd citizens from the agora into the meeting place. within red-stained rope. A fine was given to those who got red on their clothes, trying to escape or linger on the outside. Later, in 403 BC, pay for participation was used, but only for the first 6,000. And this would be an idea that would come about again during the Enlightenment period, that in order for average or working class people to participate, they must be paid for their service. Today, of course, we scoff at politicians getting paid and think, oh, this is just cronyism and they're milking the system. But actually, the only way you can guarantee that the rich aren't dominating any type of democracy or republic is if you offer a decent pay so that average people can leave their jobs and their average life to go participate civically. And a citizen, a person who legally belongs to a country or state, has the rights and protection of that institution. A citizen in ancient Athens only included Athenian men who had completed military training. Eventually, it would be expanded to those that were native born. Slaves, freed slaves, women, and children were not included. By 450 BC, both mothers and fathers had to be Athenians for a man to be considered a citizen. This meant only about 20% of the population actually participated. So even though we called it a democracy, it was still incredibly exclusive compared to the total population, especially considering how many foreigners were brought in, not just slaves, but also people doing business that were expected to contribute to society. Citizens began to gain power by also serving on juries, which had to include at least 200 people in order to hear cases. Once again, this inspires inclusiveness and the fact that citizens have a role to play. Democracy was flourishing by the time that Pericles came to power. And Pericles, coming from an influential family, was an incredible orator and could sway the masses. Pericles felt that participating in the government was important, and just as important as defending Athens in war. And so in his patriotic speeches, he embodied this pride, this inspiration of inclusiveness and citizenship, of democracy, and he caused many of his fellow Athenians to feel an equal sense of pride in their system. Then the Persian War came along, and the Persian War, and actually there were more than one, would involve Persia, which of course is a kingdom mostly occupying territory that exists in modern-day Iran. Persia was quite a bit a different system, as a multicultural kingdom. It didn't just include Persians, and in fact, the Persian monarch often allowed other people to keep their culture, their religion, even their leadership, as long as they recognized that Persian monarch in particular was the head of the throne, or king of kings. Persia, of course, wanted to continually expand their territory, and they sought Greece next, because Greece is a peninsula with many islands, many ports, and areas where they could trade and induce shipping. And so it was an important position geographically in the Mediterranean that Persia needed if they wanted to continue expanding westward. And so Persia's target was Greece, and one of the leading states involved in trade, involved in naval operations, was Athens. And so the Athenians eventually was able to convince a majority of the city-states, even incredibly reluctant isolationist Sparta, to help defend against the Persian invasion, and Persia was eventually defeated. This, of course, gave even more evidence that Athens was superior, that Athens had a great system, that Athens was meant to be a leader. The Delian League was created and continued after the Persian War ceased, because Athens recognized the importance of keeping an alliance in case a new threat came along. But also, this league could manage to induce trade and expand standard of living and cultures and values. And so the Delian League continued after the Persian War. However, this system would soon cause a new problem, because at first Athens was satisfied with people that stayed in the league, but then they wanted to expand it, so they were willing to take in new volunteers. But then they got to the point where they wanted to force, especially strategically significant islands and city-states, to join the league, or perhaps rejoin it if they had dropped out from earlier. Sometimes this would be exceptionally brutal, and Athens would use warfare, enslavement, perhaps pillaging and even razing or burning down of towns that refused to participate in the Delian League. This, of course, would eventually bring apart the Peloponnesian War. The Peloponnesian War began because some of the city-states started to getting very leery, including some of the moderately strong ones. And so they started to band together and even pursued, once again, the reluctant isolation of Sparta to come to their aid. Sparta was incredibly reserved and didn't want to participate. They had already been involved in the Persian War, which they didn't want to. Their army, their pride, their cultural symbolism of the Spartan warrior wasn't necessarily to be used in combat against others. It was meant to keep their own slaves in line. And so they weren't exactly eager to engage with Athens because they recognized that Athens was a formidable foe having such a powerful navy. However, the Spartans, after some of their main allies had been attacked, decided to create their own alliance to defeat the Delian League and the Athenians. And so the Spartan military will eventually lead the way toward a siege of Athens. It wasn't a quick war, and it went through spurts off and on. And eventually, of course, the Athenians, because they basically were only in their position because of their hard-headedness and harshness, they found themselves, of course, with allies that weren't exactly eager to help them in all cases, others who had been forced to. And so eventually their support is going to wane, and Sparta, of course, which has a superior army, is eventually going to island hop and go from coast to coast along the peninsula and encroach further and further toward Athens until eventually there is a siege of Athens to take place. Even at this point, even as a siege is happening, Athens believes it can survive because of its navy, because of its supply lines, which at this point had been extremely diminished, but because they had a democracy and their citizens had skin in the game because they were participants as citizens, proud, patriotic citizens, and this system was theirs. Most notably out of all these people was Pericles. Pericles believed more than anyone else that this superior system would last for the ages. He believed that all citizens had something to lose in this because they were participants in democracy, and so therefore, because of that motivation, because of that commitment, Athens couldn't possibly lose. Unfortunately for him, because of the supply line problems, because of a plague that swept through the blockaded city, eventually, of course, Athens would fall, and the Spartan army and their allies would successfully invade. So the end of democracy will take place when Athens falls. Their democracy system is demolished. An oligarchy of aristocrats is put into place, although they would certainly be tyrannical and come back with a vengeance and try to snap as much control as possible over the people. But more importantly is this weakened all of Greece. And so within a couple of generations, eventually Alexander the Great from Macedonia, which is to the north of Greece, would end up invading and taking over most, if not all, of the city-states and islands of Greece, adding it to his greater empire. The only positive effect of this, of course, is that Plato saw some of the flaws in the system. Socrates saw some of these flaws in the system. They passed them down to his student Plato, who then passed it down to Aristotle, who was a teacher of Alexander the Great. So as Alexander the Great expanded throughout parts of the Mediterranean, he also spread some of this information about different types of government systems, the pros and cons of democracy, and this, of course, would help influence Rome and Western civilization